Did not finish yesterday's event. Car number 126, Jeff Lewis, Newport Beach, and 55 Portland,
coming down to Manchester. You wouldn't know it by the things I've spoken on. I have some pretty varied research interests, I guess. So tonight I'm going to be talking about a research project and an exhibit that the Vermont Historical Society undertook. I started the research for this in 2017. The exhibit opened in 2018, hence the graphic up there. And when I started doing research for this exhibit, I honestly, if someone had said to me, okay, which way do race cars go around a track, I would have said, I have not the slightest idea. I would have probably guessed and quite possibly been wrong. So I had a pretty steep learning curve to learn about automobile racing, frankly, anything about cars. In general, but one thing I learned really, really quickly is that the racing community in Vermont especially is absolutely extraordinary. One of the questions I asked over and over and over again of people is what makes racing in Vermont special? What's different, what's unique about sort of Green Mountain State racing? And the universal answer I got back was pretty much nothing. Like the history arc of it is the same as, I'm going to adjust my microphone because I think I'm hitting it. The history arc is the same as local racing in a lot of other places, but what makes it really special is the people. The people who make racing great in the state of Vermont. And I got to know that firsthand as I did this research. So we're going to do just an overview of about 100 years of automobile racing history, specifically here in Vermont. Happy to entertain questions at any time. I'm also very aware that there are probably people out there in the audience who know far more than I do. So if I have mistaken something or mischaracterized something or anything like that, please feel free to correct me. I don't take that personally. I'm always learning. So pre-war, racing is going to be pretty varied. Country fairs, hill climbs, and rallies. The first automobile race in Vermont did not go very well. It took place in September 1903 at the Caledonia County Fair. This is the first time anyone had tried to race cars against each other in the state of Vermont. The fair put 3 days of racing, 3 races on 3 nights on the card. Mostly thinking they would attract locals in their cars to see who was fastest. There was a county race, a doctor's race, and an open race. The doctor's race being the idea that at 1903, the person most likely to have their own automobile would be a doctor to make house calls. On that second night, that doctor's race, the automobile driven by Dr. John M. Allen crashed. He was entering turn 3, and he missed the turn. He was going about 35 miles an hour, which was winning the race at the time. Totally missed turn 3, went up and over the barricade. He had a ride-along mechanic named Herbert Lanphier, whose job it was to keep the air pressure in the engine going by manually pumping constantly, which sounds horrifying to me. But Mr. Lanphier was thrown, as you can see there, thrown free of the vehicle and killed. And it was such a wreck, it rolled so many times that a piece of it went into the audience and struck another spectator and injured him. Dr. Allen was in the hospital for about 4 months. So not at all an auspicious start to automobile racing in the state of Vermont. And in fact, it was another 4 years before anyone tried to race cars at a country fair again. During that entire time, every newspaper in the state of Vermont published an editorial saying this was a terrible idea, man was not meant to do this. This is just a horrible, horrible thing to think about doing, especially at our country fairs. Horses are plenty. Horses are plenty fast enough, let's never try that again. So of course, 4 years later, they try it again. And from that point on, racing is a feature at just about every country fair in Vermont. I've worked with a number of different people. Justin St. Louis, who works for the Devil's Bowl Speedway, is a huge racing enthusiast. Between the two of us, we found documentation for automobile racing at every single country fair in the state of Vermont, current, former, et cetera, including, terrifyingly to me, the Tunbridge Fair. If you've ever been to that track, there are some really narrow bits there, but they raced cars down that once or twice. Most prominently, Rutland, the state fair, held racing. And a lot of times the races at this point, here's an early picture of the state fairgrounds, races at this point are not necessarily locals. These are troops of people who travel all over New England and travel all over the country as part of a set slate of racing. They're usually racing what we call an open wheel vehicle. So if you can see up there, sort of looks like that classic old race car in your mind, right? Like a kid's toy race car. So they're racing these open cockpit, open wheel cars that get going pretty darn fast. It's extremely dangerous. And these are the cars, the original cars that are going to start racing at Indianapolis and other parts of the country. So they get these traveling troops of people from out of state. They advertise them for weeks or months beforehand. You start to get to know the names. You follow them in the newspaper. And this is going to start to sort of get a sense of racing excitement in the Green Mountain State. Ken Squire, who we're going to talk about a little bit later, is a kid from Waterbury. He's 10, 12, 13 years old when these racers are coming to town, and this is what gets him excited about racing. And they really play up the idea, that thrills and spills idea. Far from it being a downside to racing in country fairs, it's a huge plus if someone crashes. I read an article that called it the sort of mechanical sublime, that sort of like weird thrill of the crash. They definitely played on. Another type of racing, I guess you could call it, is rally racing, and this is still very much a type of racing that goes on still today. Rally racing, very loosely and roughly speaking, is you moving with your automobile from one point to the other. That can be timed, it can be according to a certain map, it can be have other sort of restrictions on it. Today you see big rally races across just the Sahara or across whole parts of Asia. At the time, pre-war here in Vermont, this is a photograph of right downtown Woodstock. A lot of these rally races are sort of rich guys who have a car, and a whole bunch of them have their cars and their mechanic teams, and they plan their route ahead of time, and they advertise in the newspaper ahead of time that they're going to this city on this day and this city on this day, and they might cover 50 miles in a day, and that would blow everyone's mind. And whoever got to that city the first, quote unquote, won. So you can see you've got a number on the front of that car there. So you see some early rallies in Vermont this time period. One sort of variation on a rally, and this is sort of technically a race, right? Horatio Nelson Jackson is a physician from Burlington, Vermont. He's in a club out in California, in I believe San Francisco, when someone says to him, "I bet it's impossible to drive an automobile across the United States." And he said, "All right, I'll take that bet." At the time, he did not own an automobile. He did not know how to drive. And his wife was there with him. They had taken the train. So she took the train home. Horatio bought a car, found himself a mechanic. Somewhere along the way, they picked up a dog. And they drove to New York City, coast to coast, in 63 days, setting the first record for driving coast to coast in the United States. The first time anyone had driven cross country. He called it a race because he was trying to go as fast as he can, but 63 days is not really competitive. So that's a sort of early feature of Vermont automobile history. His car was named the Vermonter. It's actually in the Smithsonian now. It's in their travel and transportation exhibit, so you can go see it down there. If you want to Google, there are some outstanding photographs of the dog online. He looks like he had a great trip. Another early type of racing pre-war, hill climbs, and we'll talk about our Manchester hill climb in a little bit, but this is an early hill climb. This is a good early example of a hill climb. early racing and early hill climbs, and a lot of it was meant to advertise cars. So a lot of times, an automobile dealer or a mechanic or some enterprising young man who wanted to sell cars would enter his cars in this race, in a race, and then would advertise it everywhere. Come see the car that won the fill in the blank. And that's exactly what happened here. D.I. Grapes won this Essex hill climbing contest in St. Johnsbury. I don't know how many of you know St. Johnsbury, but it's on a hill. Railroad station straight up the hill. He did it in 21 seconds, which is like, I wouldn't do that today. That's horrifyingly fast, especially in 1921. And one of the great fun things we discovered when we did this exhibit is the St. Johnsbury History and Heritage Center still has the trophy that he won for winning that hill climb. And then of course he goes out, 5,000 people cheered wildly when a new Essex stock car won the silver cup, that silver cup. So he was very clearly and purposefully turning his victory immediately around to sell cars. So a couple of different scattered early racing. And now we're going to get into the post-war period. World War II obviously profoundly changes a lot of things in American life, and it pretty profoundly changes the idea of automobile racing for a couple of reasons. One reason is that there were no new cars built during World War II at all. All of the metal and the rubber and the factories and the expertise that had been going into building cars and developing new cars during the war was all rerouted to the war effort. So no new cars, barely any new parts for about 5 years. Another thing is that a lot of young men enlisted in the Army, the Air Corps, the Navy, what have you, the Marines, traveled overseas. A lot of them, for the first time, were coming out of rural environments. They may have never had the opportunity to learn to drive before, and they're taught to drive. They're taught to become mechanics. They're taught to become really inventive and creative mechanics under battlefield conditions. And a lot of them sort of get a taste, sort of an adrenaline rush, a taste for doing all these things with cars under some extreme conditions. Let's put it that way. So when the war ends, all of a sudden they're making cars again. There's a post-war prosperity boom. So a lot of people go out and buy a new car, which means all of a sudden there's a huge glut of sort of pre-1940, perfectly serviceable 5 or 6 year old cars, just that nobody needs anymore. There's a lot of young men who have come home from the war with mechanical aptitude, with a taste for excitement, and they start hauling these cars out of junkyards or a barn or a field or something like that, and they start souping them up. So we're going to start to see what happens with that. Fairgrounds racing in Vermont was suspended during the war, but it picks back up pretty quickly. The Champlain Valley Exposition starts racing. It started racing just a little bit before the war as well, but it really picks up after the war, and it starts to add local racing as well. Whereas before the war, it had been entirely groups of men coming in from out of state with really fancy cars. Now you can see your neighbor from down the road race against your other neighbor from down the road. So now there's a real sort of emotional component to it. The Mount Equinox hill climb starts in 1950. This is from, if any of you have ever attended today, they no longer let people spectate right on the edge of the course like that, because that's a terrible idea. It seems terrifying to me. So the Mount Equinox hill climb starts. It's run continuously since 1950. It remains, it's the second oldest in the United States after Pikes Peak. And it's the oldest in the world for its distance and elevation gain. So this is a serious hill climb right down the road here. They still run it every year, and they now focus on vintage cars. So if you ever get the chance to go, it's a spectacular event. But it starts post-war. And we start to get actual organized tracks here in Vermont. This is Dog River Speedway in Northfield, Vermont. It was founded in 1949. It was one of the first projects of a company called Du Bois Construction, if that sounds familiar to anyone. The Du Bois brothers had moved up from New York City, and within a year or two took this what had been an old fairgrounds trotting track in Northfield, and they start souping it up to run local cars against each other. And this is gonna, so it's 1949, it's gonna run into the 1960s, so it had about a 16, 17-year run. And pretty quickly, in the early 1950s, you see tracks sprouting up anywhere there's a flat surface and a group of guys who are willing to race their cars against each other. So East Montpelier, sometimes you formed a track simply by going in circles in a field over and over and over again until the grass was gone. And that was it. That was the extent of the landscaping, as you can see. Really, really minimal safety restrictions of any kind on the cars or on the tracks themselves. And frankly, minimal pretty much anything at the time. Flat surfaces and people watching the cars race against each other. A lot of these tracks sprang up for a year, 2 years, 3 years, maybe 5 years, and then closed because there was a wave of excitement of business owners and local sort of landowners or organizers were trying to ride, but no one had figured out what's going to work for Vermont. What's going to make a racetrack that's going to have a sustainable financial model, that's going to get a good gathering and community of cars, and is going to be able to keep going. Pico Raceway, early 1950s. You're going to see they're starting to figure it out. They've built these massive stands here. They've got some safety features, that berm there. Each time a new, I mean, safety features in air quotes, right? Each time a new track is built, they figure it out a little bit better, a little bit more. It lasts a little bit longer, it's a little bit more stable. State Line Speedway, this is my favorite picture that we found in the whole exhibit. It's absolutely gorgeous. Does anyone recognize where that spot is? That house right there is still there. State Line House, around Route 67. If you're driving today and you have that house on your right, you look to the left, there's sort of a wide, flat field. That's where the track was.
Half of the house is in Vermont.
Yeah, it's a true state line. So if you can see, this is where the state line runs, right? It runs right through the house and right through the track and right through the stands. And we'll talk in just a minute about this track holds a specific place in Vermont racing history because of that split. But this opens in 1949 as well. It's like 3 weeks after Dog River Speedway. However, they still hadn't figured out the safety aspect. And to be fair, no one had, right? These are cars that they're literally pulling out of junkyards. I had a guy tell me he would work all week. On Friday night or Saturday morning, he'd go to the junkyard. He'd buy himself a junker. He'd spend all Saturday working on the junker with the money he had earned all week. He would race it Saturday night and wreck it. And then he'd work all week and he'd buy another junker. That was sort of his style of racing. This is actually at Thunder Road, so this is 1965. But safety concerns are minimal. One of the things that came up in the exhibit was an early racing helmet. It was just a football helmet with his number painted on it in some like house paint. Just an old leather, slightly, not even a nice, newer, just an old leather football helmet. Sometimes people made roll cages out of stovepipe because it looked like a roll cage, but it was much lighter. Car would go a little faster. You name it, if there was a rule, and the tracks were starting to develop rule books by now of what you could and could not do to a car to try to level the playing field, to try to make things safer, someone was getting ahead of that rule book. The next week they'd show up with something a little bit different. I had someone tell me that in one of his first cars, they had nixed the way he'd done the grading on the front because it just, for whatever reason, but he was running an engine so hot he had to figure out better ways to air cool it, so he came back the next week with holes punched in his hood. 3-4 inch holes polka dotting the entire hood of the car, and it wasn't a rule. Worked really well for him for about 3 weeks until they caught on to that and they made a rule against that. So that should be said. One of the bigger concerns, and which is not to say that there weren't major safety concerns about what was happening on the track, but what actually finally sort of triggered a safety audit of Vermont racing was an accident at Colchester Raceway in 1950. A couple of cars went off the track, and there was absolutely nothing preventing them from going into the crowd of spectators, which they did. No one was killed, thankfully, but a couple people were very seriously injured, and that sort of caught the attention of a lot of people who realized this is a sort of a Wild West that's going on right under our noses. Lawrence DeShaw, who was state's attorney in Chittenden County at the time, he absolutely declares war on automobile racing. He says he applies the blue laws, for example, to Vermont auto racing. You can't race any cars on Sundays. He tries to ban racing in the state entirely. He's unsuccessful in that. And actually, there's a great story of he goes down to State Line Speedway because they're racing on Sunday, but technically their administrative offices were in the state of New York. So he was trying to go down and arrest those drivers for the, 5.5 seconds they were whipping around that quarter-mile track in the back turn in the state of Vermont and then heading back to New York. He made quite a public name for himself for a little while, running the sort of morality campaign in 1950 and 1951 to ban racing. He was not successful, but what he was successful in doing was bringing the matter to the state legislature's attention. So in 1951, they form a state racing commission that still exists to this day. And the State Racing Commission primarily concerns itself with spectator safety. They are still today in charge of things like, are the fences high enough? Are the concrete barriers thick enough? They have to be below the spectators to a certain level so that they can't go up and hit the fence and things like that. Excuse me. And Vermont is actually one of the very few states that has a statewide racing commission in that way, and it's largely because of that accident in 1950 and DeShaw's morality campaign. So they start making regular track inspections, and by about 1960, this sort of era of everyone's backfield has a racetrack and they're trying to figure it out, that's starting to fade. And the tracks that remain are going to start to really figure out how to make racing a real thing in the state of Vermont. The first of those that really figures it out is Northeastern Speedway in Waterford, Vermont. Northeastern Speedway had a couple of major innovations. For example, it had bathrooms, actual bathrooms with doors, not just bushes. It had a banked track, which was not typical at the time. It had a nurse's station for people in the crowd, as well as for some of the drivers who had gotten injured. It had regular concessions, somewhere you could go to buy a hot dog or a soda or something like that. All of which, it wasn't like it hadn't been a family-friendly sport before. Certainly a lot of kids really enjoyed it. But all of this made it much more likely that entire families, wives included, were going to be willing to go to a night of racing at the racetrack. So they start to have a guaranteed crowd, week after week after week. Almost for the first year or two, guys involved with that tell me it felt like we put up new bleachers every couple of weeks because we just could not accommodate the crowds fast enough. More importantly for drivers, Northeastern Speedway was the first track in the state that said, if you come here and you win here, you will get a guaranteed cut of the money we make in admissions each night. That was the first time that had happened. Previously, you'd race for bragging rights. You'd race for sometimes like the local grocery store would donate a ham, and if you won. Maybe you get a little bit of money for a really big race, but it was not guaranteed. Northeastern said you're going to get a fixed percentage of our gate take every evening. And because they're drawing more and more crowds, because they're starting to draw this family atmosphere, it's really starting to add up to some money. So one of the things that we found in our exhibit research was the actual original account book with all the checks for Northeastern Speedway, because that's a big leap forward for Vermont racing. It feels like the kind of thing that's obvious in hindsight, right? But someone had to figure things out first. So right around this time, so right around 1960, a young man named Ken Squire, who in this picture is on the right there, who I'm guessing we have racing fans in the audience. If you're a racing fan, you know the name Ken Squire. I mentioned earlier, Ken grows up as a kid. His family owns the radio station WDEV in Waterbury. And he grows up basically in the spotlight of that radio station, going to tracks. And the way he tells it, he thought that trotting racing was the most boring thing that man had ever invented. And he was thrilled when they started racing cars at the fairs, because so he could see that instead. He calls his first race when he's 12, at the way he tells it, at Dog River Speedway. One of his cousins was the announcer. He called a couple of laps from time to time, and he calls his actual first start-to-finish race at the defunct, very quickly defunct, Morrisville Speedway, after which a fight broke out, and he had to hide under the logging truck where he had been announcing from. But he, I think by his own admittance and other people's description, he's not a driver. He's not mechanically minded, but he loves racing, and he becomes an announcer. He grows up at a radio station, right? He can talk his way into, out of, and around anything. He has an extraordinary sort of presence and voice, and a sort of gift for colloquialism and things like that. So he becomes a local announcer. He starts to announce at bigger and bigger tracks. He sort of moves up in the world, and eventually he becomes the guy who's making the call to CBS Sports and saying, you know what you should do is you should broadcast the Daytona 500 start to finish. I'll call it, because this is going to be big. This is going to be sort of the next big thing. This is in the early 1970s, and they say, okay, fine, we'll do that. If anyone's familiar with racing, again, this is not something I knew before I started, but that first Daytona 500, there's a close finish, there's a fight in the pits immediately after the race, and Ken is calling it play by play by play. You can see it on YouTube, it's kind of amazing. And this is what really pushes automobile racing and NASCAR in particular into the national spotlight. A lot of people credit Ken Squire from Vermont with bringing NASCAR to sort of the national attention. But long before any of that, after he announces at a lot of different tracks, Ken has been looking around and saying, okay, what am I going to take from every track to make my perfect racetrack? And he does that with Thunder Road in 1960. He takes all of those innovations, the banked roads, the concessions, the good seating, the safety features, the guaranteed purses, all of that, and he founds Thunder Road International Speed Bowl in Barrie in 1960 when he's 25 years old, in partnership with the Cooley brothers. They set racing on Thursday nights because that was payday for all the granite workers in Barrie, and they wanted them to spend their first dollars at the racetrack before anywhere else. Ken had and still has a theory that racing thrives in blue-collar towns and blue-collar communities, and that's one of the reasons he chose Barrie, although he's native of Waterbury. Thunder Road is still there, still looks very, very similar today. You can still go Thursday nights and see racing. One of the fun things for us when we did this exhibition was that we were able to get Governor Scott to come open it at our building, which was his former high school. And he had gotten his career started racing at Thunder Road, which was a couple of miles away from where we're opening this exhibition. So it really is the kind of place where you can go and see just about anyone, still today. So Thunder Road starts in 1960 and still is going. Early drivers. I love this picture because they're just, that's what they're wearing to race their cars. There's no fireproof anything at the time. A lot of these guys own their own cars, that they're working on themselves, that they're doing all the promotion on themselves. It's their own money that they're pouring into it in this era. Maybe they've got a couple of brothers that are helping them out, or a couple of friends, like this is just what they do at night after work. They all hang out in the garage and they work on the car. You don't really get anyone who's doing it for a living in this immediate post-war period. And they're coming sometimes from all over New England to race here in Vermont. They're all ages. You've got 18-year-old kids up along guys who are, considerably older than that, racing cars just because they love cars. Another early feature pretty quickly is the milk bowl. This is the very first cow kiss. A famous feature of the milk bowl, which is raced at Thunder Road, is that the winner has to kiss a cow. So there's lots of great pictures over the years. It starts in 1962, and it's got a sort of an interesting format, and it was, as far as we can tell, the first race in the country to have this format. You race 3 different heats. Most races, right, you have a number of heats. Top people in each heat go on to the final race. In the milk bowl, you race 3 different heats, and you get a number of points, depending on where you come in the race. At various times it's been you get 25 points for first place and you're aiming for a high number, or you get 1 point for first place and you're aiming for a golf low number. But you add up your points at the end of your 3 heats. So that means you can win the milk bowl never having won a single heat. If you come in second 3 times and your first place guy crashes out in the second heat, you're good. Or you can come in first in one race and dead last in the other 2, but no one else quite matches your points from that first heat. So there's been a lot of ways to win the milk bowl over the years. It still runs every year. A guy named Robbie Crouch has won it 4 times, and he's won it every single way you can win. Without winning a single heat, winning all 3 heats, 2 heats, 1 heat, and so on. So that's Thunder Road. Catamount Stadium. So this is, after Thunder Road is a going concern, Ken Squire looks for his next venture, and he founds Catamount Stadium in Milton, Vermont in 1965. It's a bigger track. It's a third a mile, and I feel I should clarify. Most of our early tracks are quarter-mile tracks, or maybe even a touch smaller. If you've never been to a small track or a short track, and your only experience of automobile racing is like a NASCAR huge track, it's totally, totally different. They're going around so fast and they're so tight, it's just an entirely different feel to the sport. So having a third-mile track up in Milton opens it up a little bit more. People are going faster. Some drivers said it was the best track they ever drove on, and some drivers I talked to said they hated it because it made it too easy. It was sort of a perfectly planned, perfectly laid out, beautiful track in Milton from 1965 to 1987. Its heyday, as you may be able to tell, is sort of the 1970s, when there's races every Saturday night at Catamount Stadium in Milton. Another track that's founded in the 1960s by the Elms family and is still going is Bear Ridge in Bradford. C.V. Elms, Chuck Elms, decided he wanted a racetrack that would accommodate some of the cars that were no longer competitive at Thunder Road. So very briefly, a lot of those pre-war cars, those 1930 cars that had been booming after World War II, had a specific kind of engine called a flathead. I won't get into the specifics of a flathead, but essentially it was a pre-war type of older style of engine. And by about the mid-1960s, newer engines are starting to come into play, and the flatheads just can't compete. But the flatheads have that sort of beautifully nostalgic, classic look to them, and a lot of people still love them. So Chuck Elms founds this track so that the flatheads have a place to go. Now that they're no longer competitive at Bear Ridge. And they do still race sort of old style cars at Bear Ridge from time to time, dirt track instead of asphalt track, never been paved. It's the only track in Vermont that has never been paved, left today. So it was founded in 1966. Again, it still runs, absolutely 100% a family track. Really has just this feel of a place that everyone just goes to hang out on the weekends. Devil's Bowl Speedway in Fairhaven, be our closest modern track to here, is also a dirt track, founded in 1968 by C.J. Richards. And this is a track that went back and forth over the years. Sometimes it was dirt, sometimes it was paved, sometimes it was dirt. It's currently dirt. And it's doing really well over in Fairhaven. But for a time, so all of these tracks are starting to stay. As opposed to this 1950s era when a track gets founded, everyone enjoys it for a couple of years and then it vanishes overnight. These are tracks that are starting to get founded with serious intent, good financial models, a dedicated fan base, a troop of drivers who are coming week after week, and they're lasting. And they're lasting long enough that for various points in the late 1960s through the 1970s, Vermont has 5 nights of racing. Or the Northern NASCAR Tour, the NASCAR North Tour has 5 nights of racing. So you start to get guys who can make this their living. And that does a couple of things. It brings sponsorship money to racing. Previously, a guy would go to his local car shop and say, you know what, I will paint your name on the side of my car if you help me and let me use your shop after work all week. Or local tire shop, if you can spring for some extra tires every couple of weeks, then I'll paint your name on my car or something like that. And it was sort of a very personal, highly local thing. And most guys just funded their cars themselves. But as things start to get more and more competitive, as you get to that 5 nights of racing, when NASCAR comes in and helps do some organization and a sort of season-long points, like multiple track points system, you need a lot more money to be able to chase that circuit. So they start to get bigger sponsorships. Pepsi starts to sponsor various cigarette companies. Molson is on their hats. Winston sponsors. The really big name national companies start to sponsor both races and individual specific drivers. And that's good and bad, right? It means that the quality of car is going to jump up overnight. It means that the guys who are really phenomenal drivers but okay mechanics are going to get a whole crew of dedicated, phenomenal mechanics who are going to keep their cars running week by week. But it also kind of loses that your neighbor can pull a car out of a junkyard and see who's faster feel to it. So there is a good and a bad aspect to it. It's a big dust up with NASCAR. And essentially NASCAR leaves Vermont for a time, which leaves a man named Tom Curley, who is giving the drivers talk there. Pre-race meeting in the center there. He is, by all accounts, an extremely strong personality. I did not meet a single person who was like, I met him once, he made no impression. Everyone I spoke to either adored him or hated his guts. And there was just no in between. It was kind of amazing. It's very few people who have that strong a presence still. He passed away a number of years ago, still. But he found, along with a couple of other people, the American Canadian Tour. And that is today still the sort of governing body for higher level asphalt racing here in Vermont. They also do races in New Hampshire, up in Quebec from time to time, over in New York. This year they made their first venture down into Virginia. So they govern the sort of top guys that have what we call today the late model race cars. And it's based out of Vermont. The headquarters today are still in Waterbury. So this is a regional governing body for racing that's based, again, here out of Vermont. And you start to get a new generation of racers, those guys that are really charismatic personalities. Some of them may have started racing in that early 1960s flathead era, but they really hit their stride when the cars get even faster, when the sponsorship money comes in. They're extraordinary drivers, and they sort of know how to also have personalities, I guess, is what I'm saying. Bobby Dragon up on the top left, Beaver Dragon, his older brother, on the bottom left there. They have the best family name. They're both extremely successful drivers. Robbie Crouch, who I mentioned earlier, is that 4-time Milk Bowl winner. Dave Dion of New Hampshire. He's got a whole 5 or 6 brothers, and they all worked on his cars with him, the Dion brothers. Bobby Dragon in particular is interesting because he attracts a couple of different people, among them a mechanic named John Kiefer, who grew up souping up tractors and cars in farm back fields, went on to become an engineer for GE, was getting a little bored with that, and decided he would work on cars. So he starts he becomes sort of the lead engineer for Bobby Dragon's team. And he starts taking all of the engines apart, putting them back together, bringing them to the GE facilities and using all of their really specific measuring equipment, all of their fine, he'll bore things down a millimeter to make a hole slightly bigger by just 1 millimeter, put it back in the engine, run tests. He's a data guy. He's an engineer's engineer. They'll run a trial, he'll measure. They'll run a trial, he'll measure. He can still tell you today exactly what adjustments he made on what engine. They never ran the same engine twice. And this is a whole new era of just that obsessive engineering of racing engines that had not happened before. Again, previously it was like, you put the engine in, you go. Certainly they're trying to make the engines better, but this brings it to a whole new level. And he's got a whole team behind him doing that. Again, sponsorship is a big deal. Skoal cars. Your whole car is going to be done over in sponsorship. Start to get some big name local sponsors. Allen Lumber. This is a Robbie Crouch car. They sponsored him for years and years and years. Ford sponsors, Berlin City Ford sponsors Dave Dion for a long time. So bigger companies that have bigger sponsorship money. These two pictures were taken in almost the exact same place. That's the back bank at Thunder Road, turn 3. About 50 years apart. Right, the first one's 1965, and this is early 2010s. Same division. Right, top division. So these would be your featured race. But that really gives you a quick at a glance just how far the technology came in just about 50 years. Again, cars that are hauled out of those pre-war flathead looks to cars that do absolutely nothing in their life but race. They have never done anything in their life but race. They spend the entire week up on blocks getting tweaked obsessively. John Kiefer, that engineer I told you about, still works with an outfit out of Georgia, Vermont, that produces racing engines for the American Canadian Tour, and they race a car, and they have guys stand around the car in the pits so no one can see what changes they've made, so no one can snoop, and it's become a really competitive thing now. Now that we're about 150 years, 15 years of automobile racing in Vermont, 116 years now, you can get generational families into racing. This is the LeCaire family, so it's Joey LeCaire, who's still racing. There he is in his father's race car in the 1950s, Armand LeCaire. His grandson is going to be out racing this summer, probably. A couple of other, the Dragon family, remember Bobby Dragon from earlier, his son Scott Dragon, is now an annual top contender at Thunder Road. The Stockwell family is about to hit its 4th generation as well, put its 4th generation on the track. So very much a part of that Vermont story is that multi-generational racing families, but also support families. Another one of the LeCaire cousins doesn't like to drive, but is a great sort of pit crew manager, and so on and so forth. So racing, as it continues today in Vermont, Thunder Road, Bear Ridge, and Devil's Bowl Speedway are all still active racetracks. If you've never been to a short track race and you're at all intrigued now, strongly encourage going at least once, just for the experience. So again, in summary, a lot of this story, that same arc, that pre-war racing with the traveling troops, the hill climbs, and everyone trying to figure everything out after the war, and then the handful of local tracks left, that arc is similar to places across the country. But what makes that Vermont racing special is that people who have followed Vermont racing all their life, you say the name Beaver Dragon to them and they get weak in the knees. I've seen it happen. It's amazing. Beaver had a really spectacular wreck on the very last day of Catamount Stadium's racing. I mean, it's on YouTube. It's spectacular. He totally walked away from it, so you can feel safe watching it. But pieces of that car went everywhere. And when we started researching this, I must have had 20 people call me and say, I've got a piece of Beaver's car. I was there. I was there that last day at Catamount Stadium, and I snuck down and I pulled it out of the bushes, and it's been hanging in my den ever since. My wife wants me to give it to you. We did get a piece from that at the opening. He signed it for the person who had loaned it, and that person I thought was going to faint. It was amazing. So that closeness to the drivers, that closeness as, these are our friends, these are our neighbors, but these are also people who can go be heroes and who can do these amazing things for us to watch is pretty extraordinary. So I realize I apologize that no longer any ongoing programming. I created this slideshow when we were still doing the exhibit. It's over now, but we did create a podcast episode with some of the oral histories that I recorded with the drivers. So if that's something you're interested in and you'd like to hear some of these voices of the people I mentioned, our podcast is called Before Your Time. You can go to beforeyourtime.org and look for the racing episode and listen to about 35 minutes of stories from people. And we did collect quite a lot of photographs and other things that we'll be putting up on our website in the coming months, because we just took the exhibit down. Thank you, everyone.
Jeffrey Durant, 126, Louis Newport Beach, and 65 14